Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write better fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Heather Luby, the managing editor of the Citron Review.
On today's show, is fiction on its deathbed?
Is literary fiction inherently superior to genre fiction?
Does the literary canon need a warning label?
All that, plus how to write your worst fears on this week's First in Fiction.
And at this point, we would have Steve play his cool little intro music, which, in case you missed it, Steve's not here, so I'm going to have to add that in post-production. That ought to be fun. But we are lacking Steve tonight, significant lackage of Steve, but we're hoping he'll be back next week. Schedules have intervened, so we won't have all our fancy little transition music from segment to segment, but we thought we'd give this new format a try. It was Steve's idea, and I thought we tried it last week, had some mixed reviews, but I thought we'd give it another shot here with Heather, who we've not been able to have on the show for a little while. So before we jump into our topics for tonight, why don't we catch up a little bit with Heather. So Heather, what have you been up to lately?
Well, you know, it's actually been a pretty busy last couple of weeks. I have a great writing group that I'm a part of right now that I've been meeting with. I've had a recent book club meeting, and I've been doing some of my own writing. I finished a longer short story that I actually started submitting out in the last 7 to 10 days. And I'd forgotten what that submission process is like.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that.
Tedious.
Yeah, it is. I had. Are you actually getting some echo on my voice? No, now it stopped. Now I just sound like crazy. Okay. Yeah, I started the submission process as well, so I'm curious what you've been submitting, and but we've been editing for so long, and kind of nitpicking people who submit to us, and I'm like, oh man, I got to make sure I do this right. And there was like this enormous amount of pressure. I don't know if you felt that, but I felt like this enormous amount of pressure to get the cover letter right and to make sure all my ducks are in a row and all of that. Did you feel that same kind of pressure?
That's exactly it. And every publication, you know, I made the point of submitting to publications I was familiar with, that I thought my work would be a good fit for. But as you said, each place might have different submissions guidelines, and knowing what it's like for us on the editor's end, I made sure that I went publication by publication and made sure my submission was perfectly aligned with the guidelines, which really did vary from place to place. And it isn't just as simple as, like you said, like even switching up a cover letter, but yeah, formatting, how they want the manuscript submitted. And, you know, do they want a Word document? Do they want a PDF? Is my name on it or my name not on it? Do they want a cover letter or no cover letter? And trying to keep track of all that. And even finding for me what was an appropriate place to submit, because my story is 8,500 words long.
That is a lot of words. Mine
that is a lot of words.
In keeping with true microfiction status, mine is, I'm going to say it's 750, maybe as much as 800, which for me, when I'm doing short fiction, especially specifically Flash, I tend to be closer to, 150, 200 words. I really like staying to one page. Most of my Flash fiction is only a page, so it's like less than 300 words. So for me to bleed under the third page, 750, 800 words, it seemed longer for me, and that process of writing that, and it was actually a request I had from an editor I know who has another Flash fiction magazine. So you need to submit something to us. So I was, man, sure, I haven't written Flash fiction in forever. So, I thought, it's not that tough. It's so tough, hard. Yeah, I have a new respect. Not that I ever lost my respect for our submitters, but when you're looking for publication, specifically in the Citron Review or any place that publishes Flash, Flash is a whole different animal, and it takes a different kind of eye, a different kind of ear. But I really enjoyed the process. A nice little story, kind of a father and son kind of a thing, but it doesn't take the typical path that you would expect it to. I think it's a great little story. I really enjoy writing it. So what are your 800 or 8,500 words about?
Its first iteration, I began at Antioch as sort of a completely different story that was surrounded, or I guess it takes place where a retired couple are going to leave town, and the husband didn't want to leave because he'd sort of had a, let's say, platonic affair with another woman. And that story just was not successful, and it sat in a drawer for a long time. And then last summer, I began a revision that I submitted for workshop when I went to Swanee. I got those notes back from workshop, and I've spent the last year working on this piece with my own writing group. And then I actually hired Sarah Cipher, who is an editor for the Three Penny Review, to do a full edit of the piece with me as well. And what it turned out to be actually was more of a love story, a platonic friendship love story between two men. And that's how I changed it. That you have a gentleman that's, you know, nearing his 70s, and his wife wants to move away from the farm that they've always grown up on, you know, live together on it in a small town. But his best friend has Alzheimer's and has been put into a nursing facility.
Right.
And has no family. And so he doesn't want to leave his friend. And so the real story centers around male friendship and the love that they have for each other, and his sort of hesitancy to move on into those golden years with his wife because he can't stand to leave his friend behind.
Oh wow, yeah, that sounds great. I remember the early iterations of that at Antioch. I think I was privileged enough to read one of the early drafts of that. So, wow, putting a lot of work into it, working a year on it. My story, An Affair to Forget, which is, you know, it also makes an appearance in the bargain. Yeah,
I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah, I spent years on that thing, getting that thing ready to go. Did I ever send you Drive to look at the flash fiction that I just wrote?
You did not.
Oh, now
I can't believe you haven't taken advantage of, you know, our
Yeah.
relationship. You need to ask me for those types of favors. That way I can ask you back.
Yeah, well, you're the managing
flash
editor,
fiction.
so.
I promise I won't make you read any 9,000-word stories.
I definitely should do that. But since you're the managing editor, you know, since you're my boss now, I didn't know if that would be appropriate. So.
Oh yeah, like I'm the boss of anything.
When
you have nothing but a staff of writers, I'm not sure you're ever the boss of them.
That's a good point. So, which reminds me, this is totally off topic, and our listeners really don't care, but I'll talk with you a little bit about that other magazine, that other Flash magazine. I was talking with the editor today, and he wants to, or earlier this week, he wants to maybe do some cross-promotional stuff. So we'll talk shop later.
That would be great. You know, there's actually, I think it's, is it Driftwood, maybe? I'm thinking is the name of another recent Flash publication that, by happenstance, I actually ran across sort of Googling the Citron Review. I like to do that and see sort of, you know, what's the word of mouth out there about us, if other people mention us in their blogs, and they do.
Right.
We've had some great feedback out there from submitters on their own blogs talking about us. And this new magazine that's popped up in the last year on one of their pages where it talks about like what do we look for in submissions. It said, you know, we're fledgling, we're new, but if you're wondering what styles we're looking for, please check out these magazines. And they list like 5 or 6 magazines. The Citron Review is one of them. And we're in really good company. We're sitting there, you know, with like the New Yorker and Glimmer Train. And then there's the Citron Review on this list. And I was thrilled to see that.
So I got to give a little bit of background. I think we've talked a little bit of background on the Citron Review before, and maybe we should just do a whole show on that process, because I've gotten some, I've had a few people contact me and say, hey, what's the process of going about starting an online literary journal? And the fact that we're still at it 5 years later is kind of a big deal. And
it's a very big deal.
Yeah, there's a certain element of pride. You know, there's a certain satisfaction there on my part, since it was my baby, it was my idea, and I started it, and you know, got some great people on board, and that's really why it survived. It has very little to do with me, and more to do with the great people I surrounded myself with.
As you say, you're being very humble, but you're right. The longevity of the publication itself really does set it apart, because it means that we're serious about what we're doing. Because we're all volunteer. Yeah, we're committed. We're all volunteer. Nobody's getting paid, but we care that much about putting the work of other writers out there.
which is a lot like this podcast. We're dedicated and we're committed, and even when we fall down and possibly break our wrists, we still show up to cast.
For our viewers to see, right?
So
go to urgent care, get a splint, come home and do a podcast.
On your smartphone because you have no Wi-Fi service.
Right?
So,
because the lines, they think that construction in the area has broken a line.
And so you are now casting a cast. Oh, I need Steve to do a rim shot right now.
I know, you need him here for the
Pump. So, all right. Well, that's awesome. We'll talk a little bit more about the Citron review and stuff on our own time. I suppose we should honor the time of our listeners and kind of get into some of these topics here. Yeah, absolutely. So our first topic, real quick, I just, Steve pulled 3 articles, so I pulled 3 articles because, I'm a follower, not a leader. But is fiction on its deathbed? This comes from MotherJones.com, and I'm going to have to flip over, so pardon my wandering eyes and randomness talking. It's on MotherJones.com. I'll put the link in the show notes. But essentially, did you get a chance to read this, Heather?
I skimmed that one. The other couple of articles you have up in our main topic, I spent a little bit more time with. But if I remember correct, when I was skimming through Mother Jones, it was it starts out, I think, with, is it the editor of the Virginia Quarterly? He's like at a soccer game, and someone asks him what he does, and he tells them, and he's sort of getting the feeling where maybe he's becoming obsolete.
Yes, exactly. And this is not a new criticism of fiction, but this idea that people who publish fiction, specifically journals, literary journals, small literary journals like the Citron Review, like some of these college presses that they have, even though many of them are very prestigious, I think the attitude of the general public is that they've almost, I guess, run their course, that they're played out, that they are relics of an older generation, and they are no longer, relevant in our society today.
I think that there's a little bit of that out there for sure. One of the, interesting sort of subtopics of this type of discussion is also what literary, like online journals have done. I've noticed that in particular with the Citron Review, because we like to nominate our writers for awards like Best of the Net, Best of the Web, the Pushcart Prize. But I know, and I've read where the editor of the Pushcart Prize anthologies has made it very clear that he doesn't believe online publishing to be legitimate, and so far the Pushcart anthology has been dragging their heels at including any online journals in the pieces that they select. So I think that those types of attitudes might be a response to, if you sort of feel like you're attacked, or you sort of feel like you're becoming obsolete or less important, instead of trying to kind of move on with maybe where fiction and publishing is going, we're going to dig in our heels and sort of fight back by insulting what the change is.
Right, and I mean, every industry has this, right? The music industry had it with the Napster and all these other types of things, and you see the recording industry digging in its heels. To a large extent, Hollywood at large digging in their heels on digital rights, media, and all that kind of stuff. And publishing is no different. It's in the same thing. But in the element of prestige, and I think that's kind of what we're getting at here, is, are these publications archaic? Have they run their course? And I don't think they have. As a matter of fact, I think the grounds for them have increased. And I remember a publisher talking once about how the market is so much harder to get into because so many more people are submitting. And I would agree with that, which is, I think, indicative of the fact that it's not dead. It's not archaic. It's a thriving industry, number one. Number two, it's a competitive industry. And number three, it's a growing industry. And as you say, like the proliferation of online journals has made digital publication much, much easier and has really streamlined the process. But if you look at a publication like the Citron Review, we are no less discriminatory, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Selective, I guess, is a better word than discriminatory. We're just as selective as some of these kind of traditional print type publications.
Absolutely. In fact, I guess, again, being the managing editor, I can tell you that, for instance, if you look on Duotrope and you look up the Citron Review, it'll say that we accept something like 4% of fiction pieces, which sadly is not true, because that is just obviously a representation of the people that are reporting to Duotrope. We,
yes,
through Submittable, have a much more accurate picture of what we actually accept. And of the thousands of submissions that we receive each year in our genres, and for our listeners, we're being dead serious, of our thousands of submissions,
yes,
we're accepting somewhere between 1% and 3%. And that's extremely competitive and
very
much in line with the more reputable or prestigious, whatever word you want to use, long-term print publications.
Right. And our point in saying that is I mean, I know it may sound a little bit like we're patting ourselves on the back, and that's not the goal of this at all. The question is fiction on its deathbed? It's not. It's alive and well, and it's alive and well because of the competition within the marketplace. Like any other industry, competition is what really drives the industry. And so that this kind of competition that we're seeing, and when we accept 1% to 3%, it's not because we're getting 97% of really awful submissions. We're getting some really solid submissions in, and there are lots of times where we are writing letters to authors that say, hey, we loved your story. We can't run it, though, for whatever reason. And again, it goes into finding the right house, the right publication for your story. But a lot of quality fiction out there. There's a lot of quality fiction out there.
I know that originally there was some argument that, the fact that, say, anyone could go out and start a literary journal and do sorts of things might take some of the prestige out of writing. Because, say, you could build up a bio of publications that maybe didn't carry the same weight that it did before because the ease of publishing online and so forth. And I think maybe that was true at some point, but I think that we've been publishing online, and I don't just mean the Citron Review, I just meant writers in general.
Yes.
For long enough now that the competition is out there. And as you said before, I think this is where not only younger writers are coming, I think all writers are coming online now and using those avenues to submit and see their work published and gain a larger readership. We know now that there are more young people reading today than ever before. And so, I don't see it dead as all. In fact, I see that as we move forward, that as long as literary journals are willing to change with the times, I think that you can see a combination of print and online journals that continue to have excellent fiction, lots of competition, and lots of readers.
I agree. And I would even say that fiction is about as dead as poetry. And I know that sounds harsh, but I mean, that's to say that poetry is not dead either. As long as there is art, I mean, fiction is art. And as long as people appreciate art, there will be fiction. There will be music. There will be paintings and sculptures and poetry and nonfiction essays, creative nonfiction, which people always scratch their head at. I don't know why they think that's so oxymoronic, but I've read some fantastic essays that have stayed with me for years after. Consider The Lobster, David Foster Wallace, the Gestalt of Star Trek, Andrew Panebianco, who I have the honor of knowing. Andrew's a great guy. We had him on the show some time ago. Quality individual, and everything that he writes is equally as creative, even though he does nonfiction. It's just as creative as what we do as fiction writers. It's an art. It's for sure an art. So absolutely. So.
And I think that the last thing I think maybe we can say about this is that, but in order for fiction to stay alive, I think it does require people like you and I, people like our listeners, people like our submitters, people who go into the bookstore and buy things, people who seek out journals online. I mean, it's that whole literary community that isn't just the writers or the publishers, but it's the readers and it's the supporters of that literary community as well.
Yeah, and that's a a big thing. As it is anywhere, you've got to support the art. If you, it's easy to get free media. It's easy to get free stories. I mean, we'd be lying to ourselves if we said we couldn't get a free book as easily as we could get a free song. Those avenues exist, but again, it's really up to the readers and to the writers to support each other, and the readers to support the writers. I love Peter Hollins. I think I talk about him quite often. This dude's a YouTuber, and he, I mean, one of the greatest voices that you'll hear. He does a cappella music, he does covers, etc. Buy all his stuff online for $1, or listen to it free on YouTube. Does he care? Well, obviously he prefers you to buy it because that puts money in his pocket and helps him, allows him to continue performing his craft and creating this beautiful art that he creates. And yet, he's not. It's free. If you want to take it free, it's free, and he doesn't think any less of you. It's just a great avenue, and to see that he is surviving that way. Not only surviving, but I think he's doing fairly well because he continues to produce some great quality products. And there's a ton of them out there who have made avenues like that work for them. So long story short,
yeah.
What was that?
I just said, and it's good karma. I think if you are an artist, or if you know you're friends with, married to, related to, love an artist, even if you're not one yourself, and especially if you're one yourself, it's good karma to put it out there and, like as you said, support the work of other artists.
Absolutely. Well, shall we move on to our second topic here?
Yes.
The age-old question, and I'll let you tackle this one. This comes from the New Yorker. Quick little article. If we summarize it real fast, the idea that genre fiction is not necessarily subservient or in any way less than or of less quality than literary fiction. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, even when I originally read the title and I knew this subject matter, and one of the first things that pops in my head is like, how and who is measuring? Like, who has a measuring stick out to say which is better? I think that,
yeah, exactly.
I don't know, it's sort of arbitrary to me. I know that there are smarter people than I am out there probably discussing this in a much bigger sense, but, as a reader, it seems not an important question to ask. Maybe the better question to ask would be, what moves you as a reader, and where can you go to find that?
That's a great question. Yeah, absolutely.
They were talking about how obviously there's writers that fit predominantly in genre fiction or literary fiction. I think he mentioned Richard Russo, for instance, for literary fiction. I don't know that he gave examples of genre fiction, but of course I could throw out someone like, let's say, James Patterson.
Right.
Or maybe a romance novelist. I don't read romance, so I can't think of a name, but
Let's throw out, Daniel Steele, but we could also include Stephen King in that. Dean Koontz, we could include in that. Or even John Grisham, we could say is a genre fiction writer.
Is a genre writer.
Yeah.
And then, he mentioned a couple of names of people who sort of straddle that line. Cormac McCarthy, Jennifer Egan, Kate Atkinson. They all kind of straddle that line. I thought I'd throw in one of my own as well. I know the book's a few years old, but I was thinking of, did you ever read the book Zone 1?
No, I haven't. Who's it by?
I'm blanking on the name. It's going to come to me while we're having this discussion. Because it's essentially a post-apocalyptic sort of like zombie novel.
Okay.
But it is written just like a piece of literary fiction. And it's very lyric language for a subject matter that readers would usually put into a more of a literary fiction category, and
Sure.
More of a genre fiction category.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like genre, when we're talking about things like legal thrillers, we're talking about zombies, horror, but Western, sci-fi, fantasy, all included. I think there's a lot of room now within genre for more literary elements. One of the things I keep hearing from everybody, and I know this may not be the greatest example, but the series Walking Dead Everybody tells me, "Oh, it's so well done. The writing is incredible." So I tuned in and I watched the first like 2 or 3 episodes, I think. And the first episode I thought the writing was pretty solid. Some good character development. The dialogue was crisp, refreshing. But at some point it became gratuitous headshots, and that's kind of when I lost interest, because that to me was just not very sophisticated. But then you look at something like The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and I'm just in love with Cormac McCarthy, man crush, if you will, or at least with his prose. Not the man personally, I've never met him, but just beautiful,
People have,
beautiful
apparently.
prose. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. But I mean, The
Interesting
Road
is amazing, right?
right?
I
It's
mean,
post-apocalyptic, and
again,
still
it's a topic that people would assume is more genre. It's apocalyptic, but the writing is something different. It's interesting that you mentioned The Walking Dead, because I do watch the show, but mostly because I've read the series of graphic novels. I
sure.
guess I'm still reading, right, because they still continue to come out. And I'm a huge fan of the graphic novels and really of the literary merit of the graphic novels. So I sort of tune into the show to see how closely they're doing the show compared to the graphic novel, which
Right.
They're not doing a great job of following the graphic novel.
At some point, they have to depart. I think there's from what I understand, a lot of things in the graphic novel that you probably just can't do on TV. But
you cannot do on television.
yeah, I mean, maybe I don't know. Game of Thrones, you look at that. I mean, that's changing some of the rules of what's on television and such too. But that's another one that I would throw out there. George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones, which very genre, but also very well done, very well crafted. Very attuned to his language and very aware of his prose and the imagery that's used throughout. Very well. The series is very well written. Haven't watched the entire series, but the books, I've read all the books, and I think they're fantastic. So is literary fiction better than genre fiction? I think it's better than some genre fiction, in the same way that I think some genre fiction is better than some literary fiction that I've read as well.
I agree, and I think that you and I are probably on the same page. As I think the writer of this article, and I don't quite recall who that is, but I know that he quotes Lev Grossman in saying that the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. That we've reached a point, I think, in what is being published out there that these things can coexist. They can be together. I think that before, people used to sort of view things that, the plot-driven is genre and the character-driven is literary. And yet, writers that you think that you could easily put in those separate columns are both doing those things at the same time in their work.
Yeah.
I think essentially it's about reader connection. And if you can make your reader worry about your character, which so very often is done by upping the stakes with your plot. I know we've talked about this before. Then your readers have that connection, and so I think both literary and genre fiction have to have both of those elements if they want to be truly successful. And I'm judging success not even necessarily by the money a book makes, but by what I think its impact can be on its readers.
Yes, and I love the way you say that, the impact on the reader. We, a lot of times, one of the, I think, mistakes that a lot of beginning writers make is they're writing for themselves only, and they forget that there's a reader involved, and understanding that what you're writing is designed to have an emotional impact on the reader. That's paramount to writing something that's going to be lasting. In the same way that I've read some post-apocalyptic novels where I get to the end, I'm like, yeah, whatever. I don't care if everybody dies. But, I read The Road, and I'm genuinely interested in the fate of this boy and his father, and that relationship. I'm a sucker for father-son stories, if you haven't figured that out. I don't know, maybe I've got some daddy issues. I can talk about it next time I have my dad on here, maybe.
I was like, your poor dad.
Yeah, I know, right? I think it's more because now that I have my own sons, I think that connection is there, and I'm always desperately wondering if I'm doing a good job as a father, and what would I do if I was in the situation, having to take care of my son in these types of situations? And really hits home, really hits home. And when it's done well, when it's done right, there's that impact that sticks with you.
I was going to say, this seems like a really good spot that I'm just going to go ahead and plug the book that I'm reading right now that
Sure.
I would really recommend to any of our listeners. I am reading the novel, if you guys can see it, Gangsterland by Todd Goldberg. And this is a perfect point in case of what we've just been talking about, a book that has a lot of plot. There is violence and mayhem and betrayals. It's an excellent page turner. Yet Goldberg's writing is so on point. It is raw and like beautiful. It is somehow both to the point. It's not necessarily overly lyrical, and yet it touches a very sort of emotional part of you when you're reading it. I'm only like halfway through, but I'm loving this book. So it was Gangsterland by Todd Goldberg.
Right on. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, we could list a lot of books, but
I'm sure.
Gangsterland by Todd Goldberg. So, last segment, I guess we can transition here for the sake of time.
Sure.
Tough topics in the literary canon, or does the literary canon need a warning label? There are actually some students now, this comes from the New York Times, by the way, and I'm going to flip over to that article real quick so I know what I'm talking about. It's long story short, there are several college students who are feeling like they need a warning before they read some of classic literature, like some of the content in The Great Gatsby can be very questionable, and other things like Huckleberry Finn, Things Fall Apart. Those are the ones that are listed particularly in this article. But it also raises the question, things like the reason this resonated with me is because in my undergraduate studies I had to read The Color Purple. Mm-hmm. A women's literature class, and I read like the first few pages and I was done. And I told the professor, I don't think I should have to read a book that talks about these types of things. It was a graphic retelling, if you will, of basically sexual assault on a little girl. And if you've read it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Pretty horrendous stuff. And I could not handle it emotionally, and I told my professor, I said, I'm not trying to get out of work, but I genuinely don't feel I should have to be made to read something like this. And she looked me in the eyes and said, you're still going to be responsible for the tests and the essays, etc. And I said, that's fine. I'll find some way to get the information that I need. But I didn't read it, and I didn't realize that. Perhaps I should have. I didn't realize that going into the novel, but I remember that had that profound impact on me. So I'm not saying, as a teacher who teaches many of these listed novels, my first instinct is, no, of course it doesn't. These kids already know what's in there. But they don't. And is it my responsibility as an educator to let them know? And what happens if I have a student that tells me, hey, I don't think I should have to read this book. We read Slaughterhouse-Five together as a class. Love that book. That definitely needs a warning label if we're going to talk about objectionable material. So I'm curious what your take is on this, if you've had any similar experiences either in graduate studies, postgraduate, undergraduate.
Well, I do know, I read the article. I was sort of aware of this topic, basically being on social media when this was sort of making the rounds not too long ago. I know that it sort of has its roots in feminist thought that I think maybe it was at University of California of Santa Barbara where I think that they were first trying to move forward, I think, university level of having, as you said, some type of warning label. There's some explicit material. Other college, I think like Oberlin has adopted that, the article said. Mm-hmm. I sort of feel like I'm straddling the fence here in the extent that I think most literature, much of classic literature, many of the books that I feel are important for people to read are questionable in some way to at least someone. I know that Susan Taylor Shehawk gave a lecture at Antioch about sort of the effect of fiction on the brain. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting if you look at the scientific studies that show that unlike watching television, going to the movies, somehow when our brains engage fiction, there are areas of our brain that will light up on that MRI as if we were actually experiencing them. And she talks about the importance of using fiction in order to build empathy. That you might never leave, your small Midwestern town, but that you could have empathy and understanding for the plights of people all over the world that you have nothing really in common with, and have, like I said, a true sense of empathy, and all this is because of fiction. So I certainly think that fiction can be felt on a very deep emotional level, and it can change us. And it's one of those reasons that I'm feeling sort of conflicted on this, because on one hand, I think that's why it's absolutely important to read even the things that make us uncomfortable. It would be really easy to shy away from material that is ugly because we'd rather not engage ourselves with that. But on the flip side, I can think of, I remember reading the book We Were the Mulvaneys by Joyce Carol Oates, or Alice Sebold's book, Lucky Bones. Not Lucky Bones, though that one's a very Lovely Bones. And it's not Lovely Bones because it was the book Lucky, where she depicts, her, and this is a nonfiction account, but of her rape. I can understand where that material deserves a warning. I'm not sure how I feel about, giving up material that might be questionable, or telling students, you know what, you're uncomfortable with that, you don't have to read it. I don't know how I feel about that. But I will say, as a teacher, anytime that I'm presenting something that falls into any category of, violence and abuse, and especially things in sexual situations and wartime issues, I feel like it's my duty as a teacher to at least give them a heads up.
I think if I had had a heads up and I had known about it going into it, I would have had a different attitude about The Color Purple. If I knew that it was a finite section of the book and that it didn't persist throughout the entirety of the work, I might have been a little bit more comfortable. I might have been able to skip the first chapter or 2 chapters. I know there's a lot of objectionable material throughout, but I was so blindsided.
You're right, a teacher. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's fair to give that warning so people aren't blindsided. I think if you're a woman who's been a victim of sexual assault, and you sit down and you're in a classroom full of tons of people, and you bow your head and everybody's kind of reading over a piece and we're going to discuss it in class, and you are faced with that.
Yeah.
That I would never want to do that to one of my students, because I don't know their personal histories. I think any material deserves a heads up. And then I think when it comes to a student, if someone came to me privately and like you did with your teacher and said, hey, I'm not sure if I could read this, I think that that's probably something that's best not regulated. Or I'm uncomfortable with universities handing down sort of blanket generalizations and statements of this is always required and no, you can't force a student, or any sort of blanket policies and rules. I think those types of decisions are really best handled on that personal student-teacher basis.
I agree. I think it's our professional responsibility as teachers to handle that. I remember at one point one of my students said, hey, I want to read this particular book. And I was like, do you have any clue what's in that book? Oh, yeah, I know. I said, I don't think you do. And they said, oh, no, I've read the reviews and stuff. I know what's in it. And I'm like, that's your choice. I can't even remember the name of the novel now, but it was awful, just objectionable from start to finish. And he got halfway through and he goes, I can't read this anymore. He's like, I'll take an F, but I can't read this anymore. Can I do an alternative assignment? Of course you can, man. I mean, I warned you, but I'm not going to make you, as a professional, I'm not going to let you suffer because you made one bad choice. And he, to his credit, he changed gears. He started another novel, got his work done. So good for him. But I'm always very careful to warn my students and say, look, it's a wartime book. Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carry. It's a war book. Right. You're going to struggle. You're going to read about the water buffalo, and you're probably going to cry, and you're going to be better for it. But just know, there's a water buffalo. It's very sad. Very sad. So those warnings, you know what I'm talking about?
I absolutely do. In fact,
Oh,
not only have I read the things they carried, but I'm going to brag. I have a signed copy. I
okay.
met
Can I?
Tim O'Brien last summer, and
No.
he was at Swanee. So I spent 2 weeks in Tennessee, and I met him, and I met his lovely wife, and
Hashtag
yeah,
Matt Jelly. So
I know.
you are the third person I know that has met Tim O'Brien. Actually, I know two writers. I've met two writers who are apparently first name basis good friends with him. Whenever they see each other, they go out and grab, like hot dog and a beer or something like that. One of them is
Well, I
James
wish that were
Brown.
the case for me.
Yeah, one of them is James Brown, who teaches at Cal State San Bernardino. He's a professor of mine.
Yeah.
And I looked at some of his books, and they're all endorsed by Tim O'Brien. I'm like, how do you know Tim O'Brien? He's like, oh, college, we go back. And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah. I was like, okay, so I'm a little bit of a fanboy there, just kind of geeked out a little bit. Love Tim O'Brien and his stuff. So
He is, I have to say, very wonderful, very gracious, so approachable, and having heard him read in person from the things they carried, there was not a dry eye in the entire reading, and he got a explosive standing ovation.
I want to stand up and applaud right now. I haven't even heard of it. I just the book is just, I mean, incredible. It's a life-changing book. It is.
It is.
So,
And like you
there's
said,
my
I
book.
think it would be such a disservice, right, to some of these great works if we had some sort of on the books loophole throughout universities that might allow people who didn't want to have to read something difficult, right? And not difficult in terms of
The challenge,
reading
but
level,
something, yeah.
but yeah, something that's emotionally difficult to read. And I'd hate to see students have sort of a on the books loophole to get out of that.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right. I think bureaucracy can definitely over manage, can over require, if you will, regulate. That's what I'm looking at. Can
Right,
over regulate
right.
things and regulate the life out of something. So I think it's a conversation that's worth having. I think the students have every right to make requests of their school's administration, and I think the school administration should regulate flexibility into it without being rigid, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have the professors, hey, be understanding, make sure that you're listening, handle it as you feel is best for a professional. But you make the point. If we don't have our students read challenging, objectionable things, nobody reads Shakespeare anymore. Shakespeare's done inside of a generation, right? Because I don't think he wrote anything that could be taught. I mean, we have our freshmen read Romeo and Juliet, which is borderline pedophilia. What are they, like 13 and 14 or something like that? And I mean, it's right. There's some questionable stuff going on.
Yeah,
Gender bending, guys being a girl, being a guy, being a girl, kissing a guy that's a girl, and all sorts of stuff. That's just, I mean,
suicide. Right.
Thank you. Right.
Yeah.
And so murder and violence.
And really, if I'm trying to think about the books that have probably influenced me the most, they have all on some level been emotionally difficult books. I know we've already said The Road like 1,000 times tonight, but
Yep.
in particular, that was one I found very challenging to read. I put it down on my nightstand more than once while I was reading it because I was crying and I had to put it away for the night and might not come back to it for 2 or 3 days because for me, I just felt it that much.
It takes some determination to get through it. What is it? The bullet with two guns, or the gun with two bullets, rather. It's late for me. Yeah, I mean, just talk about the symbolism of that and the fact that he carries that the whole time. I mean, there's just so much in that book that's just heart-wrenching. You feel it in your gut. And I think this is a good place to kind of transition. Notice my smooth transition.
Look at that.
One of the reasons I know, it's like I planned this or something. One of the reasons I
People are going to
picked
think
this-
we're starting to get our act together.
Oh, I don't know about that. I don't think anybody will ever assume competence on our part. But the idea of writing what you fear, and this is advice that I heard while I was at Antioch University. And Stephen King talks a little bit about it, like his story, where do his story ideas come from, what terrifies him, and that's what he writes about. But I think on some level, it's more than just clowns, which terrify everybody. 'Cause let's be honest, like, when was the last time you saw a clown and you felt okay about it, right? You know, like, there's a clown, now I'm happy. A clown, I need to go to someplace else. Um, but more so than just what you fear, it's the emotional things that you fear. And so real quick, I'm just going to give my take on this and how I handled this, and I'm curious if you heard the same advice, how you handled it, etc. But if we go back to The Color Purple, anything about children being hurt is very taboo in my book. As a matter of fact, Steve and I we had this idea years ago. We were co-write a story, right?
Wait, I'm backing that up right here.
Okay.
The first startling, upsetting piece of fiction I ever read by you has a child death in it.
Oh, are you talking, Out. Are you talking about Out?
Yes, I'm talking about Out.
And,
so I knew that it wasn't like someone like inflicting, like, you know, nobody was like murdering the child or anything, but that to me was, again, as a mother, a very startling and upsetting story that did in fact, you know, have bad outcome for a little one.
You know, maybe I'll publish that in the show notes. I don't know, but to make reference, it based largely on a personal experience, everything up into the death part. You know, husband and wife take their son to a hospital for a surgery. Child doesn't make it out, and so the question in my mind, I had to take Josiah in when he was, I think, just a year old, or maybe a little bit older. It was a very simple procedure, but you know, in the back of my mind, what am I afraid of? I'm afraid that I'm not seeing my son again. And I had this vision of walking out to the car and seeing the car seat, and it's like, what do I do with that? And that's where that was the darkness from which that story was born. I wrote that in my later years at Antioch, after I wrote a piece called Story of a Man, in which there is a graphic scene of a child being molested, a little girl being molested, and which is just, it was the worst thing I've ever written in my life. I don't feel good about it, but it was one of those things I kept hearing: write what you're afraid of, write what you're afraid of, write what you're afraid of. And that's what I'm afraid of. Not that I'm going to be hurt, but thinking about any child in any situation being hurt. I'm so empathetic, I guess, that it really just crushes me. I can't even I don't even listen to the news, quite honestly. I make my wife screen my news for me because I'm tired of hearing, you know, so-and-so left their baby in a car seat. I can't handle that. That messes me up for days. And so I wrote this piece called Story of a Man, based on the recommendation of those at Antioch who said, write what you're afraid of. And I wrote that scene, and I genuinely feel that I made some serious progress in my career as a writer, and in the craft. I feel I'm better at the craft now because I wrote that than I was before I wrote it. That being said, quick disclaimer, I don't know that I'm ever going to publish that or seek to get that published. I haven't even read it since I did it at Antioch. You know, I workshopped it and then I was done with it. I don't want to go back to it because I'm still terrified of it, quite honestly. I still can't handle kids being hurt. But I do feel like it was a beneficial experience for me. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I agree. I mean, I certainly think that the topic in general of sort of writing as therapy is a pretty common thing. But I think, as you've mentioned, this is taking it sort of beyond that and what it means to the writer in terms of developing their craft. I think that as a writer, if we can tap into our own fears and write about that, if we can harness that fear into our writing, that this is one of the ways in which we can give our characters dimension. Right?
Yes.
We're able to give our characters dimension because we are tapping into our own fears. As you said, the goal here is not to exploit some topic, but really to give voice as well. You know, I think ultimately we sort of fear things we don't understand. or that we have a hard time contemplating. As you said, this idea of if you lost your child, going out and seeing that car seat and not knowing how in the world you would ever deal with that. How something like that could even happen in a world, right? How do we live in a world where children are hurt? Mm-hmm. We don't understand that. One of the ways to get to that understanding, right, is writing it so that we can help sort of give voice and understanding to these terrible things. And I think it does two things. I think that it makes us a better writer. And I also think that the writing itself benefits. Therefore, I think the reader benefits. I think it, like I said, it adds dimension.
It kind of goes back to what we said about Tim O'Brien and the disclaimer that I give people. You're going to read about a buffalo. It's going to make you terribly sad, and you're going to be a better person for it. Nobody enjoys reading that as they read through it. But when they're done, they're like, I've been through something. And quite honestly, I've come through on the other side. And I think in some way there's, I guess, maybe a victory, if you will, in that. There's a part of your personality that can grow, that can mature through that. I think the process helped me empathize not only with victims but also those who perpetrate the crimes, because most of the time these are not people who have had very good lives themselves. The perpetuation of victims, and victims beget victims, and the abused become abusers, and it's a sad fact of a fallen world, but it is the world in which we live. And if this is something that I refuse to write about, that I continually turn a blind eye toward, I'm not capturing the world in its entirety. Flannery O'Connor talked about that. People accused her of sensationalizing violence, sensationalizing these dark, demonic kind of characters. And she's saying, you know, sometimes you have to put a magnifying glass up to a problem for people to see it properly. And so sometimes it is a mix of hyperbole and truth, but a lot of times, you know, fiction can be a magnifying glass, and it can call attention to things in our society that have to change. Something as simple as the grapes of wrath, right? You think about that. When writers started to decide, hey, what we put on paper, the words we put on paper, can have a tremendous impact on our society, can have a positive change, but in order to do that, we need to, you know, explore the darkness that's there. We have to shine a light on it so that people stop ignoring it and pretending like it's not there, and we have to recognize these things exist, and how we deal with them is up to us, but to continue to ignore it is not going to solve the problem, and it's not going to help anybody at all.
Well, and that's where you have to have a writer who isn't afraid to write about the topics that fear them. And we all have something that we fear. And so as writers, if we're all brave enough to go out there and write about the thing that we fear, as you said, we're not only able to put work out there that is going to build empathy within our readers, allow them to suddenly empathize maybe with a person or a situation that they wouldn't have previously. But the process of writing and writing through that, we gain empathy.
Right. Absolutely.
In fact, my novel, when you were talking about like sort of gaining empathy even for like your darker characters, when I wrote my novel, and because I was writing from a male perspective, he's a cheater. And and cheated on the wife. Well, I'm a wife, but suddenly I was putting myself in the shoes of a man who had been unfaithful to his wife. And I really had to live in his skin, and it really gave me such deeper empathy about, the fragility of marriage, and that, can people deserve forgiveness, and are certain mistakes indicative of who a person is?
I wrote a lot about affairs as well, and so much so that I think my brother-in-law started to wonder about me. And I think, I started getting Facebook messages, if you ever cheat on my sister, I will kill you. And I'm pretty sure he meant that. But those stories were born out of fear. Not that I would cheat on my wife, never contemplated it. But the fact that what would happen to me if she did, and how would I handle that? And so it wasn't always from a male perspective or a female perspective, but it was one of those things as a newly married man that it was something I was afraid of. I was happy in my marriage. I still am. Didn't mean for that to be past tense. I'm happy in my marriage, but I was terrified that something might go wrong. I was terrified that I might accidentally screw something up, not for reasons of infidelity, but just be from saying something stupid, maybe.
It becomes your process as a writer of trying to come to terms with what are those things deep down inside, sometimes even on a subconscious level that we're having a hard time dealing with. And how do I put that on paper in a way that helps me work through it, makes my characters richer, helps me gain a sense of empathy, right, that I might not have had before, and then I give that gift to my readers.
Right. Exactly. I mean, I want to make a couple other points too about this writing what you fear. I think it will make you a better person, but I also don't want it to be a thing where you question yourself. Like you can, for example, I wrote about child molestation. I've never been molested, nor have I really known anybody personally who has been, nor have I ever molested a child. But I'm so terrified of my children and something happening to them that it became kind of a very taboo topic. The stories that I wrote were, I don't think, necessarily therapy for me, but it was a step in widening my perspective and coming to grips with a part of myself, a fear, perhaps an irrational fear, and you can debate that, if you'd like, but I might have taken a rational fear and brought it to the irrational realm, but it's helped me, I think, in my writing to be more confident, and now I'm not as afraid when I'm dealing with stuff that maybe my character has this in the past, and I don't want to write about it. But so that means I'm going to write, a less complete character because I'm too afraid to go to that place. But if I can write about it a couple times, get that under my belt, even if I put the story away and nobody ever sees it, I'm totally fine with that. I think we as writers should write plenty of things that never see the light of day, that no one should ever read. It's a process. It's a craft. How many paintings did Michelangelo do that no one ever saw? How many poems did Frost write that nobody ever read? It's a process. You practice,
I think it's so important that you say that, only because there's so many times that I think that the end goal of any piece of writing shouldn't be publication. Not everything that as a writer we have to let ourselves off the hook. We don't have to tell ourselves, oh my gosh, anything I ever put on paper, I have to write and revise and polish, and it needs to be published in order for it to be like legitimate.
Right,
no,
exactly.
Write whatever you want, and like you said, and be comfortable with that it goes in a drawer.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to be a good writer, you've got to have a drawer full of stuff that nobody ever reads, except for you. Right. I mean, and that's really what it boils down to. And does that mean that you are deliberately writing and hoarding everything that you... No, I mean, you practice, you keep your practice, you look back at your practice, you recognize your mistakes as you would in any art form. In the same way that athletes watch game tape of not only their performance, but also of their, of their opponents, the competition, etc. Yeah, you gotta know what you're doing wrong in order to get it right. And so there's nothing wrong with practicing a little bit, putting something in a drawer. Don't put everything in there. But what you'll find is
learning where you want to put your effort.
Thank you. Yeah, the fuller your drawer is, I think the better off your published work or the work that you're sending out for publication is going to be. So yeah, don't publish. You don't have to worry about publishing everything, just the right ones.
Just the right ones. Whenever you gave me this topic, I started looking online and I came across a quote I really liked by the writer Natalie Goldberg, and it was, write what disturbs you, what you fear, what you have not been willing to speak about. Be willing to be split open.
Oh,
And I
isn't that?
really love that quote.
Oh,
I think
absolutely.
it's easy to find online, and I think you should throw it up in our show notes. It was just, I thought that's exactly it.
Yeah. To write what disturbs you. Yeah. What was the last part of that?
She says, I'll read it all one more time just for the benefit
Sure.
of our listeners. Write what disturbs you, what you fear, what you have not been able or willing to speak about. Be willing to be split open.
There we go. Be willing to be split open. I like that. I think that's
Be
a great
willing to
title
be
for the
split
podcast.
open.
Be willing to
I
split
love
open.
that.
Yeah,
And then I also
absolutely.
ran across the late Joan Rivers, right? She also, I think, talked a lot about, in terms of comedy writing, but, advocating of writing not what you know, but what scares you. What are you afraid of? I think it's because even as a comedy writer, she understood that, truth often comes from that place of fear, and that we sort of have an obligation, I think, as writers who can recognize that truth and the things that are deep sat down inside of us. I think that we've been given gifts, and maybe I'm inflating my own sense of talent, but as writers, if we feel like we've been called to be writers,
Hmm.
and I'm someone who does truly believe that that is what it is, it's a calling to be a writer,
Yes.
then I sort of feel like it's our obligation to bring everything to the table as a writer, and that includes being willing to confront those dark, sort of terrifying places.
I'm going to throw out a couple things here real quick, and then we should probably start
Sure.
wrapping up because of time. But
And my phone's got like itty bitty battery.
okay, so we'll go quick. But this writing what you're afraid of allows you to be transparent as an author with the reader, and I think that transparency creates trust. And when a reader can trust a writer, they will follow them anywhere. And so,
Yes.
even if you're not writing about that particular thing, the fact that you're willing to be split open is going to be transparent enough to your reader, and they'll pick up on that and they'll trust you. But I also just quick little shout out again for Flannery O'Connor, who wrote Mystery and Manners, her essays on writing, where she talks a lot about that as writers we've been given a gift and to a large extent a responsibility, and we need to use those gifts properly. And she's got a lot of really intriguing things to say. Whether or not you agree with her, it's great to read and hear her ideas. So Mystery and Manners is definitely a book if you're interested in reading a little bit more about this and the rights and responsibilities of authors as artists. That's a great place to look.
Excellent. I just want to throw out there really fast, I obviously was aware of who Flannery O'Connor was. I had read A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Mm-hmm.
But it was sort of the extent of my knowledge of her until you and I became friends at Antioch.
Uh-huh.
And it was you who encouraged me. I went out and I bought collections of her work. I got Mysteries and Manners. So, I'm such a bigger fan now, all thanks to you.
Oh, she's brilliant. Like, I read her and
Yeah.
I just go, I wish I was half as smart as her. Like, I really do. And it was Steve Heller who turned me on to Flannery O'Connor and said specifically for Mystery and Manners. I'd already was well aware of her short works and her novels, though I hadn't read her novels at that point. I've since read them and I love them both. So, good stuff. Definitely some good stuff there. So, well, excellent. Heather, how can people get a hold of you?
I'm easy to find. You can just go to heatherluby.com, and once you go there, you'll get links to my published works, how to find me through social media. And if you're interested in checking out the Citron Review, it as well is easy to find. You can just go to citronreview.com.
Oh, that's right. It's not the Citron Review anymore,
There's
is
no
it?
the. It's just
That's right.
citronreview.com.
I was
So
like, wait a
heatherluby.com.
minute, something's wrong.
Yeah, and citronreview.com. Pretty
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah, excellent. All right, and as always, you guys can find me on aarongansky.com. I've got plenty of contact information there. Find me on Twitter at ADGansky. You can find me on Facebook at ADGansky. I guess it's not at on Facebook, but just search for my name will pop up.
Search for your name. Yeah.
I'm so good that I'll just pop up if you search for my name. So, well, we really appreciate you guys joining us, and thanks for listening. Until next week.
Good writing.